How the Cold War Reshaped African Christianity. What if the Cold War was not only a contest between capitalism and communism, but a deliberate experiment in controlling belief at planetary scale? What if religion was not merely present in foreign policy, but engineered into it as an operational instrument? Not symbolically, not rhetorically, structurally, quietly, permanently. In the late 1940s, American intelligence agencies faced a strategic paradox. Military superiority did not translate into ideological dominance. In newly independent nations across Asia, Latin America, and Africa, communism spread not through invasion, but through narrative. It offered dignity to the poor, identity to the colonized, discipline to fractured societies, and moral clarity to populations exhausted by exploitation. Traditional diplomacy could not compete with a worldview that promised historical destiny. The Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department began asking a question that was never meant for public hearing. If ideology functions like religion, then can religion function like counter-ideology? This question quietly reshaped American foreign policy. Religion was attractive because it possessed four strategic advantages that governments could never manufacture. First, it had trust. Religious leaders were often more respected than politicians. Second, it had infrastructure. Churches, missions, schools, clinics, and charities already existed deep inside communities where embassies had no reach. Third, it had moral legitimacy. Religious language framed obedience, sacrifice, patience, and social order as virtues rather than political compliance. Fourth, it had transnational mobility. Missionaries crossed borders more easily than diplomats. Aid organizations entered unstable regions where armies could not safely operate. By the early 1950s, American intelligence agencies began quietly mapping religious networks the same way they mapped railroads and oil pipelines. They analyzed which denominations dominated which regions, which seminaries trained leadership, which missions controlled education systems, and which religious broadcasters reached mass audiences. Religion became a terrain of influence. Funding pipelines followed. Private foundations linked to U.S. policy interests began channeling resources into religious education abroad. Seminaries were expanded. Mission hospitals multiplied. Faith-based radio stations received transmission support. Religious NGOs became preferred partners for humanitarian distribution. These were officially charitable initiatives. Strategically, they stabilized ideological alignment. The logic was simple. A community anchored in religious identity was statistically less receptive to Marxist materialism. A population taught moral absolutism resisted revolutionary relativism. A church-trained leadership pipeline competed with Communist Party cadres for local authority. Faith inoculated societies against ideological capture. This was not accidental. Internal policy discussions framed religion as a social immune system. In Latin America, evangelical expansion was quietly encouraged to counter liberation theology, which leaned toward socialist politics. In Southeast Asia, Catholic and Protestant missions were supported as stabilizing anchors against revolutionary movements. In Africa, the strategy became even more consequential. Africa was entering independence. Institutions were fragile, borders were artificial, education systems were thin. Religious organizations already controlled much of the continent's schooling, healthcare, and community leadership structures. Whoever influenced the churches influenced the future elites. American-linked missionary organizations expanded aggressively across sub-Saharan Africa during the Cold War. They built universities, leadership institutes, media networks, and aid systems. Curriculum choices mattered. Theological framing mattered. Leadership training mattered. Emphasis on personal salvation over structural political change mattered. Moral messaging subtly reinforced Western-aligned social values, economic ethics, and authority structures. This was not colonialism in the old form. It was ideological gardening. Seeds planted in the 1960s still bear fruit today. Many African political elites were educated in religious institutions shaped by Western funding priorities. Many civil society leaders emerged from church-based networks rather than secular movements. Many national moral debates remain framed through religious authority rather than civic philosophy. Political legitimacy often flows through pulpits before parliaments. Even modern electoral behavior across large parts of Africa is mediated through religious endorsement structures created during Cold War alignment strategies. But there is a deeper layer. When religion becomes tied to geopolitical alignment, theology itself shifts. Emphasis moves away from systemic justice toward individual morality. Economic suffering becomes spiritualized rather than politicized. Social obedience becomes sanctified. Authority becomes moralized. This stabilized societies during ideological competition. It also delayed structural reform. Africa inherited not only borders from colonialism, but belief architectures from Cold War strategy. Foreign aid dependency patterns were reinforced through faith-based distribution systems. Leadership pipelines remained externally influenced. Moral authority often outranked civic accountability. Religious fragmentation sometimes mirrored geopolitical rivalries rather than indigenous culture. The Cold War officially ended, but the architecture remained embedded. Modern foreign policy still leverages faith-based organizations for influence operations, humanitarian legitimacy, stabilization campaigns, and narrative shaping. China now competes in infrastructure. The West still competes in belief ecosystems. The uncomfortable revelation is this: religion was not merely co-opted, it was systematized as infrastructure of influence. Not manipulated crudely, but cultivated strategically. Belief became logistics, faith became supply chain, morality became governance lubricant, and Africa today still lives inside that architecture, when churches dominate education, when pastors influence elections, when foreign-funded religious NGOs shape social policy, when public morality debates mirror external ideological frameworks. These are not accidents of faith. They are historical outcomes of geopolitical design. This does not invalidate sincere belief. Millions worship authentically, but sincerity can coexist with structural influence. The Cold War taught global powers something enduring. Control weapons, and you control territory. Control belief systems, and you control generations. The battlefield was never only missiles and spies, it was classrooms, pulpits, relief trucks, radio waves, and conscience formation. The real question now is not whether religion was used. The question is whether societies understand the invisible systems shaping their moral and political instincts. Because the most powerful empire is not the one that controls land. It is the one that shapes what people believe is normal, righteous, inevitable, and unquestionable. That is the legacy of the Holy Cold War.